So, I guess to start, when did you start writing, and how did you get your start?
I remember starting writing at around, well, probably 12. And at 13, I had a librarian that discouraged, well, she didn't believe I wrote what I wrote. It was a poem.
Uh-huh.
And so she basically claimed I had plagiarized. So that actually put me off of writing for many years. I just said, screw it if that's the way I get the reaction I get. But then it took me a long time after high school to like feel comfortable with doing it again. So it was later in life for me, at least a few years after high school. And then I started doing it by myself again.
And you just kind of picked it up by yourself. You were interested in it.
Yeah.
You didn't? Did you take classes in high school to help you with that? Or?
No. I stopped taking classes, English classes because of that.
Mm-hmm.
So, but and we didn't have the internet when I was out of high school. So
Right.
I read a lot, and I just got into reading. I read a lot of sci-fi back then, and I tried my hand at sci-fi writing. Yeah.
Awesome. What inspires you to write? Why do you write?
Why do I write? Well, I've been dealing with that question lately. I'm revisiting that question lately. It's sort of like I play music too, and it's sort of like music. It's in me, so I just feel like I have to do it. Otherwise, I don't feel whole. It's like a compulsion almost. It's not like I have any kind of like huge message I need anybody to hear. Mm-hmm. It's just like an art form that I need to express. Yeah.
Awesome. That makes perfect sense to me. That leads me to another question that I have. I was going to save it for a little bit later, but now's a good time. Do you believe that writing is more of an expression of the author, or do you believe that writing is a way to get into the reader's mind and like express what the reader is feeling?
Well, I'd imagine there's probably a little bit of both out there. Various authors doing other things like Borges. He's definitely, he does exercises in literature that are meant to tease the mind. I think it was, what was it? Lazy Dog was the one. I can't remember. That may be the wrong title, but he was like an experimental writer that was messing with minds. Another one is Ben Marcus. But for me, I just write because I don't write to teach a lesson. I write to express myself. Yeah.
Awesome. That's excellent. So I looked you up online and I found you got a couple different things published. No, I found all good things, so don't worry. I just want to know, what was the very first thing you got published, and how did you get that published?
Oh, the first thing I got published, what was it? It was a couple essays. They were historical retrospectives of African American authors, and I got them published in an encyclopedia of African American artists or authors.
Huh.
Yeah. So Demby was one of the authors, and gosh, the other one's eluding me. That was so long ago. Forget the other one offhand.
Right.
But yeah, basically an encyclopedia was my first publication.
Nice.
My first creative writing type endeavor was, I think it was a poem. I think it was poetry.
Okay.
Yeah.
So how, with that poetry that you first got published, do you remember how you got that published? Like, were you submitting stuff, or did someone contact you the first time?
It was me submitting the hell out of all of it. Like, I had about 5 things I thought was ready to publish. You look back on your writing and you wonder about whether you were ready at that point or not. But I had about 5 things that I was looking to get published, and I just kept sending them around. I sent them to as many places I could find, and I figured out that on a guesstimate, the average is you'll send something out about 60 to 70 times before you get it published, if you're lucky.
Wow, that's a lot. Yeah, so I've heard that from you before because I took your class,
okay,
and
yeah.
I remember you always used to say that, just submit everything as often as you
That's
can.
right.
So I noticed when I was looking at some of the things that you've published, there are a lot of different types of publishers out there.
Mm-hmm.
For example, I remember there was the, I believe it was Message in a Bottle Poetry,
Mm-hmm.
and Tactile Publishing.
Mm-hmm.
Tactile was the one that did Heidi Floating.
Right.
Right? So all of these different kinds of publishers, what are the pros and cons to different ones? Are there ones that are better to submit to, ones that you should more avoid when you're starting?
Well, that depends on what you're trying to long-term achieve as a writer, right? Me as a professor, it is better for me. It looks better for me to get published in heavyweight literary magazines, right? Literary journals and stuff like that. My story, or my nonfiction story, When Spandex Was King, the South, I think it was Southwest Review, that it was published in. That's a heavyweight, so that lends me some credibility as a professor and stuff. But for the, just like a kind of like, just somebody trying to build up a resume that isn't in the academic field, I think wherever you can get published is good. I mean, you know, there's some that are basically fly-by-night online places that wouldn't necessarily lend you too much credibility. But for the most part, publication is publication, you know. In this day and age, there's so many online publications and so many journals that are now online that I probably am the one that's not up on which ones are which now anymore. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I get
Yeah.
you. There are a lot. Like, I didn't even realize until I started doing this how many there really are.
Yeah,
Like,
there's
you can
tons
get them
out
everywhere.
there. Yeah.
So I was able to read your story, Heidi Floating, because that was just published up there. I don't know if it was the whole thing or if that was just a part that was published on the Tactile.
No, it was the whole thing.
Okay, that's the whole short story.
Yeah, that was one that I held off on. I actually sent that around to a lot of places, and they there's only been two things I've written that I never wanted to change, that I wouldn't change, that I wouldn't edit,
Right.
and that was one of them. So I published that with an online journal because they accepted it, and I would have liked that to be published in one of the heavier ones too, but
Right.
yeah.
So how did you get the idea for Heidi Floating? Like, how did you end up getting that out there?
You mean for the publication?
For writing it.
Oh, for writing it?
Yeah.
I wrote the opening scene first, and that's where I think it's a grandfather and his grandson at a telescope at Elephant Point, and then I didn't know how to finish that story, and so then I decided, so I put it aside, just that opening scene, and then I came up with another story of Heidi and Duncan, who is, by the way, the name of my dog, because that's when we got the dog, I had just written that, and my wife wanted to name it after a character in one of my stories, so my dog's name is Duncan. But as I was writing it, I was like, hey, that would be cool if I wrote a bookend story. And so I put that story inside the other story, but I made the connection between the two, the location. So the beginning and end of the story are the same characters, but the middle are different characters, and the only relation is the location.
Right.
So, and I don't know how disjointed it was. One of these days when we're not in an interview, I'll ask you what your interpretation was.
Well, that's excellent. Yeah, I really liked it. I think that it had, a great story to it, and it didn't seem disjointed to me. It made sense.
Cool.
So, it was great. So, as I understand, you only have one novel published right now. Is that right?
Right.
Okay, and that's Bottle Hollow.
Correct.
What does it mean to you to actually have a full novel published?
Well, at the time, it was awesome. Like, I mean, it meant everything.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, it was a big deal. It was a big deal to get that published, and it was a really small publishing house, and I don't even know if they're in business anymore. But it's still, they still carry the contract because I'm not looking to shop it around anywhere, so I just allow it to sit where it is. But at the time, it was a big, big deal for me. But right now, I think I've matured as a writer, so I'm shopping another manuscript around that I'm taking my time with. That it's definitely much more difficult to get it accepted because I'm going to the larger publishing houses this time.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if that directly answers your question, but at the time I was excited.
Right.
Yeah.
So I talked with another author that just barely got their very first thing published ever, and they were like, "Yeah, it's so cool. Like seeing your name in print for the first time is so amazing."
Yeah, yeah.
So that makes complete sense to me, and that's kind of what I want to encourage
Right.
people to do. You know, just
Right.
be like, "Oh yeah, that's so cool."
That's what happened with when I published When Spandex Was King, the piece that was in Southwest Review. I think that's the name of the publication. New Plains Review. I had no idea that I was being published with a fellow writer from my grad school.
Huh.
And he was getting published in that same edition with a nonfiction piece as well. And it just so happens that the two of us, they had like, I don't know, 10 nonfiction stories in the publication, but they decided that his and my name, him being Patrick O'Neill and my name, were the ones they used on the cover of the publication too.
Oh.
So to see that was exciting. You know,
That
to
is
see
it.
it on the front cover of the publication was exciting.
That is exciting.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Excellent. Let's see. So, I asked you this already, right? With the different publishers, what are pros and cons to the different types of publishing companies and the different publishers that you've used or that you know about?
Well, small publishing houses, generally you probably have a easier chance of getting picked up because they're willing to take a look at new work, new people, new authors, and experiment with, investing in the new regime of authors coming out, right?
Mm-hmm.
So small publishing houses are a good way to get started, unless you're pretty convinced that you've got yourself a pretty well developed novel and you feel mature in the writing and stuff, and that it's strong to go up against heavyweights. But generally speaking, you can't even get into, without an agent, you can't get seen at big like Penguin and Knopf and stuff like that. You're not going to necessarily have a chance to even get looked at because they use agents. But the smaller publishing houses are good places to start at. And writers and Poets and Writers has a good, in the back of that magazine they have a good list of those smaller publishing houses. Beyond that, are we talking novels or short stories or all?
Either.
Yeah, short stories, there's a lot, you have to find a home. There's different journals, different literary journals that cater to different styles. So, experimental writing, science fiction, all that stuff. So it's important to read the journals before you submit. That's a big thing. You know whether it's a match for you or not, because editors kind of get irritated if you send them a romance and they're a sci-fi or whatever. But yeah, I'm not sure I directly answered that question, but I think that had some of it in it.
No, that was great. Yeah. What you talked about doing poetry versus short stories and novels.
Mm-hmm.
What are the differences between publishing, poetry versus a full novel?
Well, you can produce a lot of poetry.
It comes faster.
Yeah, well, I mean, not to probably. I see. I'm not a poet by craft, but I dabble in poetry, and I've gotten lucky a few times to get them published. But a real poet is, I mean, somebody who is studied in poetry is just takes it as seriously as somebody who's studied in novel writing. So. There are journals for them too, right? There's high-end heavyweight journals for them too. But I've found that it's a bit easier for me to get my poetry accepted. I'm not as discerning about where my poetry gets published as I am about my novel writing. So, most of my poetry is in kind of like run-of-the-mill. I wouldn't call them mediocre or anything, but they're just not heavyweights. They're
Right.
just not heavyweights. And it was easier for me. But I think I felt easier because I wasn't analyzing my poetry as much as I was my novel. You know what I mean?
Right.
My longer pieces I analyze a lot more.
That makes sense.
Okay.
And you have a little bit more expectations for your longer pieces, right?
Right. Well, plus, when you're publishing individual things, individual pieces like poetry, you're not looking for long-term publication contracting.
Mm-hmm.
But in novels, one of the considerations is, will I make some kind of royalties off of it, and is this publishing house the one that's going to do that for me?
Mm-hmm.
And you're not necessarily, when you're publishing a single poem, you're not looking at it that way, right?
Right.
Or a collection of short stories, right? You want to see if a publishing house is going to be able to, like, how many runs how large of a run is the first printing, how many runs are they willing to pick up, and how successful or how much marketing is involved with that stuff. So you don't think about that with poetry per se.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So, do you have a suggestion of specific publishing companies for young and amateur authors to start submitting to? Maybe the lighter weight publishing companies that you're like, this is a great place to start.
Off the bat right now, I don't. Grey Wolf is one, I think, is the name of it. And there was, I just submitted to, here, let me open up I keep a submission spreadsheet. And a spreadsheet of, when and to whom I've submitted things to, and come on. And I could tell you exactly who I recently shopped some things to. Let's see here. Atticus Books, Atticus, Atticus Books, Black Lawrence Press, 11.
Lawrence?
Yeah, Black Lawrence Press, and Torrey House Press, Torrey. Those are
Torrey.
Yeah, and those are reputable small presses. Those are, I mean, even if you're shopping for a small press, you want to steer clear of fly-by-nights and stuff. You want to at least see who is. See how long they've been in business, basically, right?
Right.
How many authors they carry and stuff like that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Awesome. That was very helpful. So I remember in our class we talked a lot about self-publishing.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember there was a lot of discussion about it, pros and cons.
Right.
What's your view on self-publishing? Is it useful or should it be more avoided?
The side of the fence I've landed on with that is that if you're in academia or in a writing profession, in the writing profession, and you have a conscience to be seen as, or if it's necessary for your credentials to be seen as credible, then you want to steer clear of that. However, for aspiring writers who aren't professors and who aren't going about looking at maybe you want to be an editor at a big book company or something like that. You know, it's an open game right now. It's a new field, and people have been successful with it. 50 Shades of Grey. That author started out just self-publishing on Amazon, got picked up by a publisher, and look at that book. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't recommend it as a true highbrow literary reading, but you can't refute the fact that she became successful. So, and that happens. That's happening more often than not. Well, I shouldn't say than not, but it's happening more often these days, where people get picked up just because they're popular on Amazon. So, I personally don't have a problem with it as long as it stays with that division of credibility in academia and things like that. I am of that school, right? You shouldn't.
Right.
I shouldn't be self-publishing as a professor. I should be seen as credible enough to be picked up by a publishing house.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So I don't know very much about the process of self-publishing, and I think a lot of other people don't. How would you go about that? Do you know?
Well, there's several companies out there that cater to that. I think Amazon actually just opened up a new division that does it. You can do it right through Amazon. I know there's another one called Xilibris. I think it's Xilbris. I may be spelling it wrong, but that's another self-publishing house. And there's quite a few out there that are making a name for themselves, but and apparently it's all automated. They have a process by which they just tell you what kind of documents to upload, and of course, the problem with self-publishing is, do you trust yourself as your own final editor?
Right.
Because a discerning reader will definitely pick up on all that stuff, right?
Of course.
So, if you're going to self-publish, you should be paying for somebody else to edit your stuff. That's what large publishing houses do. That's the benefit. Large publishing houses will edit your work for you. If they pick you up, they will tell you where you've gone wrong, and they will tell you what needs to be edited and revised. So
that makes sense. Yeah, and then if you have those errors in your book when you've self-published, you're probably not going to get picked up by a publisher at that point.
Right.
So in your opinion, what should young writers keep in mind when they are submitting their work for the first or second or however many times it takes?
Well, editing, just like I just said, editing is the big one. It's a big turnoff to, and all of the conventions of creative writing too that go into editing. Like, it's not just syntax editing, line sentence level editing. It's the pitfalls of creative writing, which is probably another interview altogether. But
right.
But just to pick out a few common ones is continuity and cliches and things like this. Those are really standard editing points, but for a writer that's not paying attention, it's easy for an editor of any kind of publication to read that and go, well, I'm not going to read it any further. Right? So yeah,
makes sense. So this is something that I've had this idea myself, and I've also talked to a lot of people. And there's lots of young writers that say or that feel like their ideas aren't novel or new enough to actually get published. What do you think about that?
They're not. They don't feel like it's not new enough.
Yeah, everyone feels like they need to have a novel idea so that they can actually get published and they can.
Well, actually, I remember that time in my writing hood. That's one way to think about it. I mean, I guess when you're starting out, you believe that you have the ability, or you are under some disillusion that you will write something original and new and groundbreaking, and that will be, you'll be part of that. But I don't think, as I've matured as a writer, I don't believe that exists. There's no novel, there's no new ideas. The passion in writing and the pleasure of writing, producing a piece and stuff, I think for me now comes more in the fact that I am attempting a contemporary story within the old stories that have always existed before me. So being really a good storyteller, at the craft that's existed. It's like a woodworker. I mean, furniture, there's no new way to put furniture together. It may look a little different from here to like 100 years ago, but the way to put it together, a chair, is the same. Same with storytelling. So I think as you mature, you find that there's a pleasure in understanding how a good story's been crafted in the first place, rather than coming up with the new original one, and then representing contemporary life in that way.
That makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Oh, excellent. And what do you suggest to amateur authors, just at the base level? What do you suggest to help them be successful, either in writing or publishing?
Be ruthless in your writing routine. Somebody told, who was it? Jim Caruso, the author Jim Caruso, told me this. He said, if you write a page a day for a year, you will have written a novel a year. And so basically be ruthless in writing. Force yourself to at least write a page a day. Even if you're not going to, that page that isn't part of a bigger story, it will wind up being a short story or something else, or maybe a chapter in a novel, or maybe even a scene. But you have to force yourself to write. Yeah, be ruthless about writing.
Awesome. Thank you. All right, well, that's
cool.
Pretty much all I got.